Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Honors Lecture Series on Social Justice. My name is Dr. Philip Phillips, and I'm the Associate Dean of the University Honors College here at Middle Tennessee State University. I'm very pleased today to welcome our speaker. Dr. Jane Marcellus is a professor in the School of Journalism and Strategic Media, where her research has been focused primarily on media representation of employed women. She is sole author of Business Girls and Two Job Wives, Emerging Media Stereotypes of Employed Women, 2011, co-author of Mad Men and Working Women, Feminist Perspectives on Historical Power, Resistance, and Otherness, 2014, and co-editor of The Legacy of Mad Men, Cultural History, Intermediality, and American Television, 2019. Dr. Marcellus came to MTSU in 2003 and is an active member of our honors faculty. And we're very pleased to have her with us today, especially as today marks the first day of Women's History Month. And her topic today is campaigning for women's equality in the Depression era workplace. So let's give our attention to Dr. Marcellus.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. It's a real honor to be speaking in the Honors College and to be part of this lecture series. So I'm gonna minimize you so I can see the screen, and we're gonna talk about the Great Depression. So as Dr. Phillips said, most of my work is on media representation of employed women. I have done a lot of work on the 1920s and 30s before I kind of took this detour into thinking about Mad Men. Those are kind of my two favorite decades. Personally, I had older parents. They were older when I was born, and I'm less young than I used to be. So I grew up hearing a lot of stories about the Great Depression and wanted to do more research on it. So, just a little backgrounder on what the Depression is. And you may know this. If you ask an economist, they will probably tell you that the Great Depression specifically is about 1929 to 1933. It began with a stock market crash, the end of 1929. Up until then, things were going gangbusters. You know, F. Scott Fitzgerald age, flappers, having a great time, etc. The stock market crashed around the end of the month in October 1929, and the whole decade was a very bad economy. It got a little bit better, then it got worse. So when we think of the Depression, usually you think of pretty much the entire 30s up until World War II brought us out of it. Also, it was a global depression. I was actually, when I was in grad school, I took an entire course on the Great Depression in the history department, and there's so much to learn about it. It's a really fascinating time, but it was a very difficult time, 25% unemployment, and there's no unemployment. There's no kind of food stamps you can get on. You're unemployed, you're just unemployed. A quarter of Americans had no income at all. 20% of school children were underweight. So that was the time that we were living in. But to backtrack a little bit, before that, before the Depression, for women, things were shifting around and changing a lot. It was kind of a dynamic time in the decades preceding the Depression. Back in the 19th century, there had been this idea called the cult of true womanhood, which was this idea that there are separate spheres for men and women. And so men are to go out of the home and go to work, women are to stay home. So it's very much a white middle class ideal. And so most of my own family background is not very middle class. And this doesn't really define life for any of the women in my ancestry that I know of. But that's a very interesting concept in itself, the idea of the kind of home workplace split happening. There were no equal pay laws. So what you got paid was often based on the body that you were, in. And so based on sex, based on race, et cetera. And yet, because of expansion in business at the end of the 19th century and some other changes, social changes, kind of economic prosperity, more women were going to college and getting jobs and seeking social freedom and wearing much more comfortable clothes, getting rid of the kind of whalebone stays that women had worn before that. Literally, they took a piece of whalebone and you were sort of cinched into it. And you got to dress more like this if you were a woman back then. So much better. But even before the 1930s, even before that stock market crashed, married women going to work was incredibly controversial. Frederick Lewis Allen was a historian who wrote in the 1930s. He wrote a book about the decade of the 20s. Said nothing was as so furiously discussed as whether married women should be working, and certainly should mothers be working. So there was this kind of idea that, oh, finally, the Depression is here, women can come back home. So there was a backlash against married women working. And there was this ideal that a lot of people believed that if all the women would just quit their jobs, then there would be plenty of jobs for men and the Depression would end.
We modify them in the lab using the modified cells back.
Yeah, thanks. So there was this, there was a Ladies' Home Journal. So Ladies' Home Journal is quit publishing now, but for a long time it was like the magazine for kind of, it was kind of a women's magazine, very home-based, kind of home ec in a magazine. They did a campaign that was focused on getting women to go shopping. You know, if all the women would just quit their jobs, stay home and go shopping and spend money, then, you know, that would help end the Depression. This campaign went on for months. I actually did another paper on that and got to go to the Library of Congress and do research, which was great fun. But the whole idea that that would work was wrong-headed. For one thing, jobs were segregated by gender. So secretarial work was heavily female. Waitressing was heavily female. Public school teaching. And so it was just an idea that men do these jobs, women do these jobs. It was a very kind of binary, bisected kind of social home workplace situation. Also, a lot of women were the only family breadwinner because they could get a job and often their husbands couldn't, because there was a lot of, well, there was more demand for the kind of sex segregated female jobs. And because women were paid less, they could often get those jobs. And also the cause and cure for the Depression were just not that simple. One time I was in Knight Library and I was looking at the row of books that are all about the Great Depression. It's like several feet long, people writing about the Great Depression and what caused it, what cured it. So it just wasn't that simple. But there was this backlash. In 1936, the Gallup Poll asked, should a married woman earn money if she has a husband who can support her? 82% said no, which is incredibly high for a poll answer. The Gallup Poll was pretty new then. And a lot or some single women wanted the married women not to work, because if jobs were sex segregated and there was a shortage of jobs and only so many that women could have, then, you know, single women had to support themselves. And so, as you can see, these women are fairly blunt about what they think should happen. So it was in this kind of social situation that a seemingly boring sounding law came into effect. So 1932, like terrible year for the Depression. Herbert Hoover was president, but it was an election year. And he was going to be defeated, although he didn't know that then, by Franklin Roosevelt. So he put out this thing called the 1932 Federal Economy Act. And it was just this wide-reaching act, federal act, to kind of rein in the Depression, rein in federal spending, kind of like the Biden proposed act going through Congress now, that's about, you know, COVID relief and a bunch of other things. It was in a way the same thing. You know, they're in this very bad time. The federal government has to do something. And so the federal government had this act, which was, you know, and most of it was fine and has expired and we've forgotten about it. But Section 213 said that if a husband and wife both worked for the federal government, one of them would be fired, or was likely to be fired if there were cuts, but there were always going to be cuts. Also, that a new hire could not be married to another federal employee. So you would be asked this at a job interview, like, who are you married to and what do they do? The rationale was that, well, why should some families have two jobs when others have none? Which in a way, I can kind of see the logic of that. It did not mandate that wives would be cut, but that was almost always the reality because women were considered kind of supplemental secondary breadwinners. And also they made less. So if a family, you know, if a couple were going, well, your job or mine, it was almost always going to be the woman's job that would go. So this is just the language of the act. So one of the things I'm going to tell you later in this lecture is that they were going to make a movie out of this. It was like a love story. But so this is how it appeared in the government, very dry document. But it created a firestorm. It mattered for a bunch of reasons. One is that it codified that cultural prejudice against married women with paid jobs. In the federal workforce, women were only 5% of the federal workforce, but 75% of those cut the first year. So it was very much aimed at getting women out of the workplace. And I think the biggest thing was that there was this fear among women that it would trickle down to state and local governments and private businesses. They'd go, oh, this is a great idea. Let's do the same thing. So, you know, if the federal government can do it, we can do it. And that did happen. Also, it was the first real threat to women's independence since ratification of the 19th Amendment. So last year, we learned a lot about the 19th Amendment. Tennessee was the last state to ratify. We had the centennial. And so it was the first major threat in the kind of 12 years since that had happened. And Alice Kessler Harris, who's a women's labor historian, said that it came to seem symbolic. It was a way to spread messages about married women's employment. It wasn't really about providing jobs for men because that didn't really work anyway. So, so that's why it mattered at the time and historically still matters. So there was a big fight against it. And so what I look at when I look at things in the past is how they were covered. And also how did the news media shape the way they were understood? And how did the news media kind of affect change or arguably affect change? So a bunch of things happened. Women's groups that didn't especially see eye to eye on a lot of things united, they got together. So the suffrage groups, for example, were still around. They were doing other things. But they had not agreed at all about the approach to getting women the vote. And they got together. You know, it's like, this is too big a deal. We've got to get together. We've got to unite about this. They used their own publications. So they had magazines and newspapers that went out to the membership to define a set of rhetorical arguments. And what is so interesting about the research I did is that the mainstream newspapers actually adopted a lot of their rhetoric. Most news coverage that I found, and I looked at a lot. I went to Library of Congress. They have a thing called Chronicling America that's a lot of old newspapers. I looked in newspapers.com. I looked in the historic New York Times, Washington Post, on the Walker Library website. And there were and I just did, basic searches. There were very few that were pro 213, despite that Gallup poll, those attitudes. So And most of the arguments were, really amplifying what publications said. It became such a big deal that it became a fictionalized serial, kind of a story that was published from issue to issue, like a continuing story. And it was optioned for a movie that was never made. And I haven't been able to find out why it was never made, but it almost was. So I'm going to tell you about the magazines, the publications, and then what they argued. So one of them was, and the biggest one, really the leader, was the National Women's Party, founded by Alice Paul. This is her. Alice Paul was brilliant. She had several degrees. She had a degree from the London School of Economics. She had a PhD. She was young. And so this is her in a graduation gown. She was a young suffragist, and some of the older suffragists didn't approve of how she went about things, and so there was kind of a schism there. Anyway, before the vote was ratified in 1920, the NWP had a magazine called The Suffragist. When suffrage was ratified, it became equal rights, and you can see they look very much alike. I think she had the same artist. It was a lot of the same people working on it. It just now focused its attention. Its main goal was getting the Equal Rights Amendment through Congress and ratified. And we still don't have the Equal Rights Amendment, but that was her goal. She was an attorney. One of her many degrees was as an attorney. And she wrote the Equal Rights Amendment with some other attorneys. One of whom is from Tennessee. Anyway, they led the charge against Section 213 and really did a lot to shape the rhetoric against it and shape the arguments against it. Another was Independent Woman, which was published by this big group called the National Federation of Business and Professional Women. And they were kind of they tried to be an apolitical group. They were founded with some government money at the end of World War I to kind of help women who were working in businesses to have various needs met, learn how to network, things like that. So they were kind of like there was a lot of women's clubs in this area. So it was a business women's club sort of situation. Really tried to stay out of politics, but it had a much, much bigger circulation than the other one I showed you, than Equal Rights. So this had, just a few thousand subscribers. This had like, 50,000 roughly, I think it was. So they got into the fray too, because they really agreed with what was going on, that this was an incredibly problematic law, that a lot of people were losing their livelihoods, that it was creating problems for families, etc. So they eventually joined the fight. And then the League of Women Voters had really been at odds with Alice Paul's group when they were in the suffrage fight. They had been called the National American Women's Suffrage Association. They became the League of Women Voters right after the vote. And they didn't have a magazine or a newspaper, but they published a booklet called The Married Woman and Her Job in 1936. And so this is them. You can see they're kind of older, kind of more, I guess, established, I would call them women. But even though they didn't get along with Alice Paul, they used a bunch of her arguments, which is, I found this really fascinating, but I'm kind of a geek about this stuff. So here were the arguments that they used against Section 213. They said that it was a threat to gender equity, which is pretty straightforward. It's not fair. Some people lose their jobs, some people don't lose their jobs. But they said more interestingly that it penalized marriage, that it actually made it a penalty to get married, that there were couples who were putting off getting married because of this law, because if they got married, one of them would lose their job. and that it was leading couples to, air quotes, live in sin, which was, now it's not uncommon for people to live together without being married. It's much, much, much more accepted, but it was scandalous at the time, and it was called living in sin. And so that so they argue that, this law is going to make people live in sin. They argued that it created family hardship for dependent parents. So remember that we're living at a time when there's not a lot of, there wasn't Social Security, for example. Social Security came about in the 30s because of the Depression, but it didn't exist before that. So my mother's grandparents, they were just taken in by their children. And they didn't really, I know one of her grandmothers just sort of went from family to family and had a room at the house my mother grew up in, but then would go to some other child for, a couple of months and just sort of went around. And that's just what you had to do. You became just completely dependent. And, if you had to take your parents in. I guess you didn't have to, but you would. Also, as World War II began to get underway in Europe, Section 213 was compared to American fascism. So all these rhetorical arguments came out of the women's press and found their way into the mainstream press and eventually got the thing overturned. So the gender equity argument, these are just some examples. Dismissal without regard to effort, training, efficiency, that's just not fair. You've got all these skills, you know how to do something, you're really good at your job, but we're gonna let you go because of who you're married to. They said nothing but the ability to do the job should matter. More on the gender equity argument, and I really like these arguments. Why are women in government questioned about their marital status, but men are not? So that is now not legal to ask somebody in a job interview, are you married? It used to be quite common to be asked that. Like when I was in college, I was told, remember they can't ask that. That was kind of drilled into me by whoever was giving me advice because it was still a thing. Why are married women with large families fired, but not single men? It's like, well, a woman maybe she's the only breadwinner, or maybe she's married to a husband with like a lower paying job, but you're not firing single men. Why allow anybody who's got enough money to live on, why should they work? And then if one salary is big enough for a family, shouldn't you know how big that salary is and how big the family is? So there's, a family living, a family of 3 living on $10,000 is different from a family of 5 living on $1,000. And then why single out wives, but not sons and daughters who may have moved back home? So that's a gender equity argument that they put forth just issue after issue after issue in their magazines. The penalty to marriage argument was, I think, the one that had the most emotional appeal. It said, you're turning back brides from the altar. You're separating wives from husbands, that, there are people who are actually getting a divorce because of this. People getting a divorce. I like this picture. It really it's not exactly related, but I thought it was a cool picture of people in 1930s clothes looking happy to be together. And then, they would kind of find these personal stories. So there was this one man, he's over 50, which is hard to get a job then. He gave up his position. If he wants to go back to work, he has to get a divorce. So you've got this situation going on where on the surface, it's like, well, why should one family have 2 jobs when others have none? But then you begin to see there's all these situations that it creates. The family hardship argument said that not only would older people, like parents, elderly parents, be put on relief or put on, just be out in the street, but that sons and daughters wouldn't be able to go to college. People lost their homes, etc. So, oh, and I like this picture. It's some college kids from the 1930s. So I thought you'd like to see that, how people looked back then, I guess. Anyway, I don't know anybody at MTSU I've ever seen in a leather sweater. I guess that's not a thing. It wasn't a thing when I went to college either. So it went away a long time ago. And then the fascism argument is super interesting. So as you know, the US did not get involved in World War II until 1941 with Pearl Harbor, but it got underway in Europe several years before that, and fascism was growing. People were aware of it. So there was an argument that came forth that isn't this fascism if this happens, that there are these signs, and they're not all air quotes made in Germany. They're happening not in Berlin, in Rome, no, they're happening in Maryland. And Hitler and Mussolini in Massachusetts. So this is coming right here to our shores. And, it's not good. So this kind of warning signs were just echoed a lot in the women's magazines. What became really interesting though, was that they showed up in the mainstream press a lot. And they often were not huge stories. They often didn't make the front page. They would be these kind of skinny stories over in the middle. But the Washington Post often quoted National Women's Party sources and used their rhetoric, in part because the NWP was headquartered in Washington. And I think a lot of the Post reporters knew the NWP people. And especially the women reporters, and often were members of NWP. So now we would think of that as conflict of interest in journalism, but that wasn't so much of a thing then. The New York Times had a little bit of a different focus. They focused a bit more on the League of Women Voters and the BPW. This paper has a lot of alphabet soup in it, but they have big long names. Anyway, they reported, a lot of the reporting was, reporting on their conventions and then reporting on what they said. And there was not at this time, so this was around the time that the idea of objectivity was becoming a thing you actually talked about in newsrooms. Objectivity took a long time coming, beginning with the penny press, like in the 1840s, slowly developed over time, but it really wasn't until the 30s that it became a thing you talked about. So it just was not, you could go cover a convention and just say what was going on at the convention. And there was no particular obligation to go get the other side of the story or to go just, find somebody who disagrees with his point of view, sort of just because. And then smaller papers of the country amplified the arguments of the larger papers. In media studies, there's this thing called agenda setting, which means, in fact, that so a New York Times paper, which is a newspaper of record, a Washington Post, which has a, in the seat of government, has a wide circulation, that they will actually set the agenda for what is covered in the Daily Oklahoman, the Daily News Journal, the Tennessean, et cetera. So that's another way to think about it. It's not the kind of research I do. It tends to be more quantitative, but that's another way to think about it. So in effect, the women's press set the agenda for what made its way into the Washington Post, the New York Times, and down into smaller papers. And as you can see, this is, Women Denounce Economy Pay Act. This is about a meeting. Divorce considered by 50 US workers to hold their jobs. And this comes from National Women's Party ideas. Unions got involved a little bit, although I didn't see that much about unions. So, and then it became this love story, which was just the coolest thing. So there was a guy named Rupert Hughes. He was the uncle of Howard Hughes, the aviator, who became incredibly rich. But Rupert Hughes was this popular writer of kind of schmaltzy, cheesy newspaper serials. He was, so like, F. Scott Fitzgerald, say, published a lot of his early work in the good magazines, and it was often serialized, from one issue to the next, and then it would be a short story or a novel. This was a little bit more lowbrow. It was published in Sunday supplement sections of newspapers. It was syndicated, which means it ran all over the country. And it was just called Section 213. So this very dry federal law that's, Section 213. So I guess it was the 213th thing they thought of to put in the act. It didn't sound very interesting at all, but it so caught the public imagination through the stories coming out of the women's press, and then through them being in magazines around the country, that it became just, people were fairly outraged about it, despite the Gallup poll findings. So it was fiction. It was about Valerie and Neil, and they were deeply, consumingly in love. And just when they were ready to enter paradise, they found the gates locked by Section 213. So it's very kind of soap opera-ish kind of story. It always looked like that. It always had these drawings. There's another one. And it was interesting because Hughes used all the arguments from the women's press. So Valerie, these are fiction, it's made up. So Valerie supports her invalid father. He lost everything in the 1929 crash. So there's the argument about dependent families. Neil also supports his mother and sister. There's the equity argument. Valerie says at one point, why haven't I got as much right to work for my people? I've got to work, what am I gonna do? And then Valerie at one point considered her options, none of which were too good. She could marry Neil and resign, which would mean that his mother and sister would starve. Not a good idea. They could live together without marrying, which meant many unpleasant and hateful, ugly, sneaking, revolting things. In other words, you really just didn't do that at the time if you came from a nice family, or at least you didn't tell anybody you did. They could marry secretly, which, you might be caught if you did that. They could give each other up, and that was unthinkable. So this went on for quite a while. So it was in Sunday magazines. So you would buy the paper the next Sunday to see what's happening with Valerie and Neil. This was almost made into a movie starring Olivia de Havilland. So she was famously in Gone with the Wind. She was Melanie Wilkes. And this is George Brent, who is described as a Depression-era heartthrob. And they were gonna play Valerie and Neil. It was all set. I'm not sure what happened. I actually tried to look on some movie history websites to try to find out what happened. It was MGM. It was one of the big companies. And it was written about in movie columns, etc. So Olivia de Havilland just died like 2 or 3 years ago at 104, I think. Anyway, so this very dry law almost made it into the movies. It was going to be called the Marriage Clause. So what finally happened? Well, the logic that was used in the women's publications found its way in the mainstream press, which I've said. It overshadowed public opinion about married women working, as seen in the Gallup poll. The love story angle, I think of all the rhetoric put out, the love story angle kind of had the most traction, really caught on. It won out over the kind of gender equity, legalistic discourse. Section 213 was repealed in 1937 after a huge fight. And there was this guy, Emanuel Seller, who was in Congress, and he tried a couple of times to get it repealed, and finally had good luck. Valerie and Neil lived happily ever after. And women did get back to work. At least many did. But I wanted to kind of have a happy ending to the slideshow. Also, I really like this picture. But if you've seen Good Night and Good Luck, I don't know if you've seen that. It's a movie about the McCarthy era and about newspapers. It's got this couple working in a 1950s newsroom where they are married secretly. And like, you know, it's got a scene where the husband takes off his wedding ring and leaves it in the dresser drawer before he goes to work. And they're finally caught because everybody knows they're married, and then she's forced out. That was in the 1950s, so that was 30 years later. When I went to work for a newspaper in the 1980s, there was an older couple that I knew. The guy still worked at the paper. His wife had worked there previously, that's how they met. And when they got married in roughly 1970 something, I'm not sure, 75 maybe, she was forced out. So this law, it just was on books. It was on, you know, it was in policies of private businesses, and it was in some state laws, and it just never got taken off the books. And then finally, people began to think about it and go, you know, should this really be happening? But it all came back to this. It all came back to Section 213 in the 1930s. And people just kind of forgot about, you know, why are we doing this? And, you know, finally got repealed. It may still be around somewhere, and maybe not enforced, but maybe still there. So that's pretty much what I have. Let me stop sharing, I guess.
Great presentation. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to see all your names.
Hey, so we have some time for questions and comments. I would invite students to ask away.
I have a question.
Okay.
So how much progress do you think we have made in this topic? Like, judging by that's a really like kind of controversial topic right now, as like equality and like wage gap and like etc. So how much progress